Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on effective supplier sourcing for cost avoidance. My name is Clive Stewart, and I lead the Supply Chain Resilience and Development team in Invest Northern Ireland. This is a free service that we offer to companies to help drive improvements in their supply chain practices. I'm joined today on the call by my colleague, Jimmy Moore, who will be presenting the material and taking us through the presentation. This webinar is part of a series of webinars that we have developed to cover key aspects of supply chain management. Today's webinar will give you some insight into the effective supplier sourcing and some useful tips on how to help to actually mitigate costs. We will also highlight how our supply chain support can actually help you as we move forward. We will now go through the presentation and there will be question and answer session afterwards.
Welcome to today's webinar on effective supplier sourcing. Supply chain support from Invest Northern Ireland is provided by the Supply Chain Resilience and Development Solutions team, or SCRDS for short. We are a team of supply chain professionals seconded from business and have experience in implementing supply chain improvement in a wide range of industries. Our role is to work with businesses to analyse what they do, advise where development is possible, and provide mentoring and support through projects to deliver tangible value and cost savings. We can also provide financial support for a supply chain role in your company to deliver supply chain improvement if the resource or skills do not exist at present. Today we'll be addressing how your company's approach to supplier sourcing can improve business performance. By the end of the webinar, you should know what to consider before engaging with new suppliers. Understand the steps involved, the associated risks and how to mitigate for them. Gain a knowledge of the technical aspects of importing, and recognise the importance of including supplier relationship management for new strategic suppliers. So, what should you consider before you start looking for new suppliers? First, look at how you currently purchase the parts or services that you want to source from a new supplier. This should include the specifics of what you want to buy and how you want to buy them. This is very important so you understand the need for change and better gauge if your sourcing activity is successful after the fact. Sourcing is a difficult and time-consuming process. If done well, it can deliver great business results, but if executed poorly, it can lead to unacceptable quality, excess inventory, and damaged customer relations. It's vital then that you understand the appropriate level of preparation that's required to ensure success. This will usually involve answering some key questions before you proceed to any searching or making contact with potential new suppliers. As with most processes, it's about the what, when, who, and how before you consider going to execution. It follows then that you should have a good understanding of what is driving you to look for new suppliers or outsource if you're currently producing the products. Make sure you know whether cost is the driving change, or are there other considerations like the need for additional capacity, improvement of service, or a reduction in lead time that provide a competitive advantage. If you are clear on what you need to achieve, this will lead to better downstream decision making. A lot of outsourcing activity is poorly rated after the fact by companies, and much of this is due to unclear expectations and poor planning. A further issue to consider is the additional time and potential extra costs associated with outsourcing or a change of supplier. Integrating a new supplier will take up a lot of your purchasing team's time. If your expectations of service or quality have been unrealistic, this will also need to be managed. There could also be hidden costs and unexpected risks. One way to ensure you have a realistic view is to adopt the total cost approach. As well as the purchase cost, you consider what other direct and indirect costs there will be associated with the outsourcing or new supplier activity. This takes some time, but when executed well, it leads to better decision making and results meeting expectations. Finally, if you're considering moving supply internationally, there are a further set of risks and costs to consider. Until fairly recently, the collective view was that these risks were small and at worst manageable. Many companies have now switched their view of international sourcing, and reshoring is increasing in most Western economies. Once you have considered the risks and costs of changing suppliers or outsourcing and decided that it is necessary, it is important that you are thorough in your approach. The steps you should include are clearly identify your requirements, define and document the scope of your requirement, carry out a search for new suppliers, create a request for quotation document, and finally, carry out audits and evaluate potential new partners. When identifying your requirements, a good approach is to put yourself in the place of a potential new supplier. Always consider what information they will need if they are to deliver to the standards you require. Take time to provide sufficient detail, as usually you will only get what you asked for. This is also a good time to identify standards that a new supplier will need to have, so any that are non-compliant can be excluded at an early stage. Once you know what you need, it is good practice to include this in the scoping document. It gives you the chance to elaborate on the standards and specifications you require. The level of detail can be tailored to your needs, but assume again that if something is not included in the scope, you will have to pay extra for it further down the line. Now that the scoping document is in place, you can start the search for new suppliers. This is often the step that companies find most difficult, as they don't know where to look and they are not confident about reaching out to potential new partners. It is true that starting this process for the first time can be daunting, but like most new things we do, it becomes easier the more often you do it. The rule of thumb is to make it as easy as you can when you first do it. If possible, use your networks and trusted agencies to provide recommendations, as these will hold the least risk. If that doesn't provide any leads, carry out some targeted research, maybe through trade associations, directories, exhibitions, and the trade press. Finally, you can ask for support from government agencies like ourselves and membership organisations. This is particularly relevant if you're looking to source internationally, as they may have in-country contacts. Once you have a list of potential new suppliers, begin analysing whether they operate at the standards you require. Carter provides a good model of what qualities a supplier should be able to display, tightly categorised into 10 Cs. This provides a good framework for gauging whether individual suppliers are worth further consideration, as well as a means to rank a list of potential suitors. Although not necessary, providing an RFQ document is a good way to set it out your stall in terms of standards and professionalism, and creates an expectation in the mind of new suppliers. It works alongside the scoping document and should include any clauses such as non-disclosure agreements and time limits. Another bit of good practice at this stage is to include a questionnaire where the candidates can demonstrate how they can ensure standards of delivery and quality. The response to the RFQ can give you some insights to the quality of the respondee. RFQ and tender responses are a shop window for new suppliers, So if you find errors, missed quotations, or missing information, it may well be an indicator of the level of service you'll receive if you start to do business with the supplier. Now you should be able to begin selecting a new supplier. If possible, a visit to their factory or premises is advised. When there, you can seek evidence for the standards they claim to have. These should include how they ensure your quality and delivery through quality systems, training documentation, planning systems, and their supply chain management processes. You should also work to get behind the sales speak and find out who the company really are. You are looking to establish new partnerships, and this will be easier if their approach, culture, and philosophy fits with your own. It is also good to understand what makes them successful and how they differentiate themselves. If you are considering a long list of suppliers, it is useful to use a sourcing scorecard. This can be used to compare and rank contenders, and also to involve other stakeholders in your organization where appropriate. Finally, before making a decision, seek referrals and recommendations. Now that you've completed the process to select potential new suppliers, you should identify the risks with each of them. In today's business environment, where we're all looking to de-risk our supply chains, it is important that you take the opportunity to properly consider the risks involved with any new suppliers. So this is done upfront. As already described in the selection process, traditionally this includes reviewing their capability to deliver on time, provide excellent quality, and have predictable costs. Now, it is prudent to consider other areas, namely how resilient they are to unplanned changes, how quickly they can respond if they need to change, and what their approach is to ensure their own supply chains are sustainable. This takes yet more time and effort in an already difficult process, but it is necessary and will avoid business disruption in the future. So how do you do that? A good way of identifying risks is looking at how vulnerable a supplier is to unexpected events. The greater the vulnerability, the bigger the risk. These vulnerabilities can be easily categorized. This slide shows the main things to consider and could be used in your sourcing process in the form of an audit or questionnaire. Sustainability is an area that continues to be overlooked, but will become more of a competitive factor in the short and medium term. As with other parts of this process, a defined approach can be used to ensure you're embedding appropriate levels of sustainability in how you select your new supplier. Although not appropriate for all sourcing exercises, you should always consider whether you need to protect your interests with service level agreements and contracts. At a minimum, a non-compete clause should be included upfront. If you have intellectual property or unique selling points that need to be protected, you should definitely include a contract. If, for example, delivery is a critical and strategic issue for you, an SLA is a good way to make this clear and inform the supplier of the consequences of non-compliance. These can be detailed or simple documents, depending on the relationship you plan to have with your supplier. Another way to protect your interests is by introducing a governance process. As with the contracts and SLAs, you can decide on the levels of detail you want to include. But at the minimum, it should contain delivery, quality, and cost performance data, and be reviewed regularly, at least once every 3 months. Finally, when you have selected your new supplier, and the parameters of the new relationship are documented, you should take the opportunity to set up periodic reviews. This provides a forum for you and your new partner to have open, well-organized discussion around how the relationship is progressing and what you can both do to increase your competitiveness and thus increase sales. Taking this relationship-focused approach with strategic suppliers from the outset is a lot easier than trying to implement it at a later stage. There are also some technical knowledge that you need to acquire if you are planning to start importing. These are Incoterms and tariffs. Incoterms are selling terms which confirm where costs and liability lie when receiving or shipping internationally. Each Incoterm states when the seller's risks and costs are transferred to the buyer. It is very important you understand these before you place a PO with an international supplier. The other area is around tariffs. Each product you import has a commodity code, and this, along with the details of the country you're importing from, will determine how much tariff has to be paid when importing. The gov.uk website has a handy service that provides this information and can help identify your commodity code. Tariffs can also be volume or time limited, such as anti-dumping measures, which governments apply to protect their own internal markets. This can also be established through the government website. So, what are the next steps? If you feel this is an area where you need help, a good starting point is to fill in our supply chain checklist. It covers many of the areas discussed today and provides a framework for our initial conversation with one of our team. Then, feel free to get in touch with us at supplychainquery@investni.com. We will make contact and set up a quick call to discuss the problems you're experiencing and take it from there. Thank you for your time this morning. I hope it has helped and look forward to hearing from you soon.
Okay, thank you. So, Jimmy, I guess we've got some questions starting to come through in terms of stuff. As you can imagine, I guess quite an interesting topic and for many people. The first one that has come up is, with today's cost pressures, should I not just look for the supplier with the cheapest price?
Yeah, I can imagine for a lot of manufacturers and suppliers or people today doing business, it's very tempting to do that, Clive. A lot of people have seen prices going up and up and up, and with no just them going down, and not even a decent explanation a lot of the time, as to why it's going up. And for a lot of people, if you're pushed into the corner, it seems like the only option, and maybe for some people it is. What I'd say is, I would refer back to one of the slides we had there about the total cost of acquisition. You always have to be very careful about that, first of all. So it might not be that it looks cheap at a price level, but then when you take into consideration how much stock you have to hold, what's that cost from a warehousing point of view, the risks of obsolescence, the cost starts going up. Also, as we know, if it's cheaper, maybe there are some questions about, is the quality as good as you would get from somebody who's a bit more expensive, and are they capable of delivering on time? Do they have very long lead times and very large reorder quantities to get this cheap price? Again, those will have impacts to your cost base and what you have to do, especially your cash. And then there's the element of the cost of transport. A lot of these people would want to basically get you to take the responsibility for the transport, and also the risks of the changes of that and the management of it. And finally, I would say that just the management of dealing with high volume, cheaper suppliers. If it goes well, it's really good. There's no doubt about it. But if it doesn't, then the amount of time that you have to spend on processing, and fixing problems, and the communication time if you have your own people to do that is quite large. So I would say if you can go through the exercise of if you get a good price, you should definitely consider it, and you should go and, as we said, go and do an audit, find out if their quality is good, if their delivery systems are good.
Yeah.
And you should definitely consider it then, at the very least, to push back on your incumbent supplier and create a negotiation environment. A lot of suppliers have got used to continual uplifts, so your incumbents are probably in a situation where this a lot of commodities, the prices are now going down. So you should definitely keep yourself aware of that. It might well be that there are opportunities there for you to reduce your costs, and your prices will be going down. So I would say definitely consider it, see if the prices are there, but then just be careful, because you can get caught out.
Yeah, no, and I think it's that whole idea. You're right, about actually what are you getting for the are you getting value for money, and that total cost of ownership is really important. That you've got a supplier that can deliver the performance and in a competitive manner. The next question that's came along is, how do you find good suppliers?
Again, I think we went through. We went through that process within part of the webinar. It's a research exercise when it comes to it. If you've got a good network and people who know a lot of other people, then they give a lot of people that's how they deal with things, especially on this island anyway. And it's use that network first of all. That's the easiest thing. If you find somebody close, it's always easier. It's always easiest from the point of view of bringing them on board. It's easy from the point of view of management. And for local supply, you can also, if you don't have contacts or peers or whatever that can give private information, there are local agencies. We can provide some support. There are stipulations as to what support we can provide, but we can certainly ask us the question. And there are trade associations, and I know the local councils are very keen to be people that are promoting local business as well. So a lot of companies and a lot of suppliers are on with them to try and boost their trade. If you can't get local, then it's a case of researching the markets. And this research exercise takes time, so you have to set the time aside to do it. Just speaking from my own point of view personally, I would also have started with, start at the high level. What am I buying? So where is it made? First of all, so who makes the most of it? And try and get some macro information about that type of thing by country. Where are these materials made? Just get the volume data by country, and then find out how it's sold. There are a lot of commodities which you're dealing directly with suppliers, but there's other items like I know particularly microelectronics equipment is very difficult because a lot of the manufacturers don't want to have to sell. They're just selling to agents and to wholesalers, and that creates its own difficulties. Yeah. And then once you've got a list of countries, you basically do the research from within the countries. Just Google searches. Again, there are in-country agencies you can use. Invest Northern Ireland can help out to a certain extent. Again, ask the question and we tell you the stipulations. And there are trade associations out in each of those countries who are trying to sell to the likes of yourself. So I would try and find out who they are and get in contact with them. There's research databases you can use like Compass to try and find out by country. Again, something that we can help with if you need it. And also a good one is standards organizations. So like if somebody belongs to, if they can give you a list of companies that produce what you want and follow those standards, then that's a good starting point because there are people that are concerned about their quality and how they can deliver. And then you follow the process as we stated in the webinar. Contact and start going through RFQs and find out how they have standards and how they do what they do.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I suppose there are a couple of things there spring to mind as well, Jimmy, is our Business Information Centre, again, has access to be able, companies can access that and get some reports and things around that might support stuff. But a really important part of what you're emphasising there is the need to do due diligence and actually, make sure you're assessing and looking at the risks that are associated with, where you're sourcing from and the supplier. That's really important. The next question that's coming in at the minute is, what would you say the biggest issues facing the supply chain are at the moment? A lot.
A lot. If you had asked me a year ago, there were even more, as I said. So it actually depends on what business you're in. It depends on what you're doing, what you're trying to buy. But a lot of the commodities, which make up a lot of what we do here in Northern Ireland, the prices have went down. The supply has got better. Mostly around the manufacturing capability in most of the major manufacturing countries has went back more or less to normal. In fact, a lot of predictions are that there's going to be a bit of a deflationary pressures now on companies. They're not going to be able to charge enough, and they're going to have all the problems associated with that, especially for supply from China. I think, without a doubt, what was called as the problems is the instability and not knowing what's going to happen. If people know what's going to happen, then they're able to plan for it and they're able to do put actions in place accordingly. And I think the main thing at the minute is still what's happening between Ukraine and Russia. What's going to happen there. It looks like China and the US are starting to talk to each other. I think they've probably learned from what has happened there to say, well, okay, listen, we need to not follow and make the same mistakes because everybody has suffered. Economies have suffered as a result of what happened there. And I think associated with that, we've all seen it ourselves in our weekly shop. The amount of the cost that's increased for food is huge. But I'd say so it's kind of a mixed bag. So at the minute, the normal commodities, steel, metals, chemicals, mostly are on their way down and in large supply. Whereas the things the food stuff that come from Central and Eastern Europe and into Russia are still a problem.
Yeah, I suppose, and I think you're absolutely right. And when I look at this, Jimmy, I think the things I see is that geopolitical situation has caused a lot of stuff. And if we go back a little bit before that, you had the challenges linked with EU exit and COVID and the vulnerabilities that identified with companies in the supply chain. Where facilities suddenly had to close, etc., or regions closed, and I think that then leads into do people really understand the risk in their own supply chain? That's vitally important that companies do the due diligence around understanding their risk, how they can mitigate against that, how they can build resilience into their into their supply chain. And of course, the other huge challenge, as you mentioned, is changes in prices. We've got, been significant increases in input costs, or particularly energy costs recently. So, again, that drives a huge challenge with companies. And I suppose we'll talk a little bit later, but, again, these are things where, we've worked with many companies in trying to help them understand those areas and how they could actually do things more competitively and more effective, as part of the support that we've provided. It sort of leads into the next question that's coming through as well. Is it talks about the current challenges between UK, US, China, etc. over microchips. Is it risky to have links with a particular supplier in China or whatever in the short medium term? And I suppose there's been a lot of stuff going on around microchips and components, where you'll see facilities generally getting set up in Europe, in North America. It probably just builds on what we've talked about in terms of looking and assessing the risk where you're bringing from. If you're buying from one particular sole source or one particular region, you need to be considering what the potential backup options would be. And I don't know, what else, Jimmy, would you add to that?
I've done a bit of research on this. It's something I have a bit of background in, and I can say that it's going to be at least another 2 to 3 years before there's any significant amount of capacity comes out of either Europe or US for microchips. So I would say the answer to the question straight, yes, there is risk, but we are still very much over a barrel. So they have all the cards and they know it. So again, it depends on what you're buying. A lot of for microchips in particular, if it's something that's complex and a lot of the high value server stuff is still managed by American and European companies. Whereas if you're talking about simple controllers and that type of thing for stuff that moves, or controllers for temperature gauges, that type of thing, the vast majority of that is still manufactured in China. And Taiwan is the other place, like some of the risk associated with that. So I would say there is still significant risk, but I wouldn't hold out there being any other solutions in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. No, it's a huge one. I think it's really important that companies understand that and explore all possibilities to actually mitigate around it. There may be alternative supply routes and things they can look at. Ultimately going right back into, is there a potential to redesign your product that actually de-risks it? It's
that's very true. But I would say from a lot of the people that I've dealt with, look at the problems. It's simple controllers, and they're all made in one place, so that's part of the problem.
Yeah. Okay, so plenty of questions coming through. So this one is linking again with payments, actually linking back into, should I expect to pay pro forma on my first shipment if I'm coming in something from international sourcing?
It kind of depends on your buying power. Again, from my own experience, when you're starting to do business with somebody who doesn't know you, then they would nearly always expect to have pro forma. If somebody in the UK or even the EU-based supplier, EU-based suppliers, they know they can trust the credit-based system and the reports that are there. So you've got a better chance there. Once it's outside of the EU, even to America, or especially going to the likes of China, they normally do ask for, certainly the first shipment, to have full payment up front, which is hugely risky. And that's why you need to make sure the person that you're buying for is who they are. You're not getting, they're not stealing from you, basically. So it's a matter of spending the time, trying to find out somebody who knows them, try and find out, get videos of their factory work, and if it's a factory you're buying stuff from. And like the likes of ourselves, that we've got people in country that could possibly make it a bit easier to ask those questions and confirm that stuff. But yes, you will be asked to do that a lot of the time. I would certainly, and sometimes you just have to do it if you want to get the cheaper material, and then that's what suits you to do. You get the right quality. I would say that I would certainly have something in place that okay, I'll pay maybe the first pro forma and I'll pay the second pro forma, but come payment 3, you're down to okay, we're paying a 50% or a 30% deposit. And then the rest of it is paid once you actually receive the goods and you've done a quality check. So yes, it's very common. Is probably the simple answer to that. But it depends on your buying power. If you're a big company and you have buying power, you're probably going to be able to sway them. But if you're not, you probably aren't.
Yeah, no, I think it's a challenge, and I suppose a follow-on question which is linked with that as well is how do Incoterms work, and what should I look out for? I know you've obviously covered that briefly on the slide, but it ties in with the previous question, I guess, too.
Yeah, it does. And I covered it briefly. It's something that it's something you could do a whole webinar on, and I'm pretty sure that our colleagues in customs and excise have such things. Again, I can only go on my own experience and advise on that. And if you're planning on importing a lot of stuff like that, and you're actually building up a relationship with the company that you're buying the stuff in from a third party country, you'll get to talk to them, and you'll have it organized, and they'll put you in contact with the customs people, and it'll work out very well. Most people don't do that. The vast majority of people don't. They're buying like a container here, container there, or a pallet here, pallet there. So it's a case of you're not going to have the resources or the facility to train somebody up to figure out exactly what's involved in that type of thing. So to answer the question, if you're going to be doing it a lot, I would definitely get somebody trained up in how to do it, because it seems simple. Like you've got a chart and said, well, that's what it is, so that's what happens. But then there's things like paperwork. The paperwork written rights, and the Incoterms say that you now own the goods. You're going to pay the demurrage in the port. And if it takes you weeks to figure out how to get it right, then that's very costly. So my advice is always, like, if it's the first time you're doing it, and the first time you do it from a specific country, I would always engage with a freight forwarder. There's a good few very good ones in Northern Ireland, and again, we can help you out, and if you want to contact us, we can put you in contact with a few of them. And they know what they're doing, and they're doing this all the time, and they know the pitfalls. They'll tell you exactly what you need to do, what you need to provide, and they'll manage for you. You have to pay for the service to do it, but you're paying it per shipment, as opposed to you having somebody there all the time, or have to pay the high cost of training somebody, which wouldn't be cheap either. That'll be my advice. Go with a freight forwarder.
Yeah, and I guess there are specific trade associations where those guys are members of as well, so people can look in that direction too. Another question we had was actually around what steps should I take before engaging new suppliers to ensure an effective outcome? I know you've touched a little bit on one of the previous questions, but I think it's useful maybe to expand just from your own perspective. How do you ensure an effective outcome?
Yeah, well, it's just that, like, why is the first thing for me. I would say, if you understand why you're doing it, if it is purely down to cost, then you should ask yourself the question why again. If you're being completely slaughtered on the margin for products, And if that's driving you down to where you need to go, then at least you understand that, but you need to understand the risks as well. Like the chances are you're going to be inheriting a lot of risk with quality and delivery and all those types of things. And I would certainly say you need to put a lot of mitigation plans in place before you go that direction. So with the why, well, this will influence who you would go to in the first place, and who is appropriate and who isn't, more importantly. And then it's a case of following the steps you're going through. It's define a clear scope. Again, a lot of people say, well, I'm only this, I'm only sourcing a few things, but define the scope anyway. So you don't know how much of an expert the person that you're going to is. So just make sure you're assuming a seriously low amount of knowledge and understanding, and make sure they know exactly what you're asking for. Communicate this through RFQs if you can. It's just a very professional way of doing it, and you can register them and you can have different. So there isn't a misunderstanding, especially if there's time zones involved. You can always reference to the particular RFQ that you're dealing with at that time. Audits are very important to me for potential new suppliers.
Yeah.
Depending on how much you're going to spend. Again, if it's a commodity or something that you're not going to spend an awful lot of money on, I wouldn't spend a lot of money going and traveling to a factory, that type of thing. But if it is a strategic purchase, definitely go to their factories to see what they do, see how they do it, see the people that are involved in it, speak to them, see how knowledgeable they are. A day can save a lot of problems further downstream. And once you're ready to make a decision, talk to them about setting up supplier relations. Monthly reviews, quarterly reviews, whatever is suitable to what you're buying, how much you're buying. And then again, depending on the type of product and whether it's easily got or not, or strategic, I'd be very keen to say, okay, especially with the experience people have had recently, is set up contracts. Something that there's continually short supply of, set up a contract to make sure you've got some sort of recourse. And if something that is very important from a delivery or from a stock holding point of view, or whatever it is, SLAs are really, really useful. So a lot of people don't use them, but I have, and they're very good. And finally, the last step is one that a lot of people haven't really started doing it, and they should, is analyze the risk. Start asking questions of the potential suppliers. Well, where do you get your stuff from? How do you ensure your supply? How much stock do you hold? How much cash are you exposed to? And what those suppliers that you get them from, how are they mitigating the risk? So we're part of a chain. So you're doing this up front, and you bring in a new supplier. It's a lot easier to do it up front and find out then than get into bed with them and then start asking the questions. So that'll be the final.
Okay, thank you. I noticed a few other questions coming in there. We'll actually deal specifically with the businesses associated with that side. I'm conscious of our time. We may not be able to get through every question today. I think we've covered a lot of material. And I suppose, Jimmy, if you were to sum up, what's the most important thing that businesses need to be mindful of in the current climate around sourcing? If there was one or two things you said, well, how to be really mindful of?
Be prepared to do a lot of preparation. It takes a lot of time. A lot of people, it's just go and find out somebody else. Go and find a new supplier. It's easy. It's not. It's very difficult. Doing it right and doing it a good way, especially locally at the minute. Where it's full capacity for a lot of people, for a lot of industries. So it's difficult to get it locally. So, and the further you go away, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So spend the time to do the preparation, understand what you need to do, and I would say attune your alarm bells. A lot of people are very good at selling to you, so take everything. Yeah. Don't take everything at face value. Question everything. They should be willing to give you the information that you require, especially if they want new business. If it's existing business, then it's a bit more difficult, as I said. So when you're getting a chance to ask pertinent questions, do so.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, what we see when we're working with businesses is obviously one of the first things is, well, what's in your existing supply chain? How do you actually develop the relationships? And even, and I would say to the scope of this one today, but looking at that category management approach and actually developing more strategic relationships with companies, with your supply base, can have the effect of delivering a more competitive supply base as well. And on that end, we had the website was up earlier, but if you go to InvestNI and go for support for business, you'll see supply chain solutions and development. in terms of the web links. There it is now back on the screen. So if you click on that, you'll be able to see some further details around our specific support program. It also includes a series of there's 6 webinars we have developed to date, and the others are available to look at through that web link, and it covers some of the other important topics that we've literally touched on here today as well.